every detail matters. Every clue can change everything. Two things happened this week that quietly rewrote this entire case, and neither one has gotten the attention it deserves yet. The FBI is now in contact with local investigators. And the girl at the center of the single biggest contradiction in this whole story, the one everyone's been arguing about for 2 weeks, finally has a name attached to her coming from her own family, not from a leak or a guess online. It's the middle of July 2026, more than a week since 18-year-old Nolan Xavier Wells was found dead in the water off Horn Island, Mississippi. And this case is still nowhere close to over, no matter how many people online have already decided they know exactly what happened. If you're just finding this channel now, or if you watched the first video on this case and want the version of events that has genuinely held up since then, here's the short version. Nolan went out to Horn Island on a boat with a group of friends on the 4th of July, a barrier island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast reachable only by private boat, packed that day with holiday crowds. At some point that afternoon, his friends say he chose to stay behind to keep talking to a girl, planning to catch a ride back to the mainland with someone else later. He never made it home. Hours passed before anyone called for help, and by the time his mother reported him missing that night, a search was already needed. His body was recovered days later off the northwestern tip of the island. Nobody has been arrested, nobody has been charged, and I want to be clear about that before I go any further, because everyone I'm about to name is either a private citizen who hasn't been accused of a crime by law enforcement, or a public official speaking in their official capacity. What follows is reporting on what's been said publicly and my own reaction to it, which is opinion, not a verdict. The sheriff's language has genuinely changed this week, and I think that shift matters as much as anything he actually said. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter gave an update confirming two things that weren't part of the public record before. First, his department has been conducting formal witness interviews and has been in direct contact with outside agencies, including the FBI. Second, tips from the public have moved this case forward in a real way. This past week, he said, "We got a lot of valuable information that has come from the public. This investigation is active," he said. "It's ongoing. Compare that to where this started. His office's very first public comment that no foul play was suspected is the sentence that arguably lit this entire story on fire online. It read to a lot of people watching like a case that was already being waved through, a small county wrapping up a tragic accident before the family had even finished the search. This new version sounds different. It's careful, it's procedural, it doesn't try to close any doors, and it doesn't pretend the department has this fully figured out either. If nothing else, it's an acknowledgement that the version of events this office was comfortable stating out loud 2 weeks ago isn't the same version it's comfortable stating now. I do want to be precise about what FBI contact means here, because it's easy to overstate. And this falls well short of the FBI taking over the case. Sheriff Ledbetter did not say the Bureau has assumed jurisdiction, and nothing in his statement suggests Jackson County has handed this investigation off to anyone. Local sheriff's departments bring in federal partners for all kinds of reasons that don't involve a full takeover, crossing state lines in a search. Forensic resources a small county lab simply doesn't have, or just an extra set of trained eyes on a case that's grown bigger than the office expected. What it tells you, at minimum, is that a small county sheriff's office has expanded this well past what it can handle completely on its own, especially with an independent autopsy running in a different state entirely, and a family's attorney who has already brought in a former NFL player to help pay for it. That's a lot of moving parts for one county office to coordinate alone, and bringing in outside contact is a reasonable, unremarkable response to that, not necessarily a sign that something more sinister has been uncovered behind the scenes. There's a reason investigators interview witnesses one at a time instead of as a group, and it matters here specifically. When people know what their friends have already told police, their own memory can start bending toward that shared version without anyone even meaning to lie. It's not deception in most cases. It's just how memory works under pressure in a group after something traumatic. Especially when that group has spent the last 2 weeks fielding the same questions from reporters, from strangers online, and from each other. Interviewing everyone separately is really the only reliable way to see where a group's story holds together and where it quietly falls apart, detail by detail, without everyone in the room hearing each other's answers first. It's a slow, unglamorous part of an investigation, the kind that doesn't produce a headline on its own, but it's exactly the kind of work that eventually surfaces a detail like the one Jayvon Williams gave us this week. Now, the contradiction everyone's been circling for 2 weeks. According to Ben Crump, one young woman told him Nolan said he was heading back to his friend's boat. The friends say the opposite, that Nolan told them he wanted to stay behind with her. That young woman's name is Katie. Her sister, Gracie McCormack, posted publicly on Facebook to give the family's account of what Katie remembers. According to that post, Nolan's friends had been pressuring him to wrap up his conversation with Katie so he could ride back with them. Katie spoke with Nolan and, based on that conversation, assumed he was heading toward the boat he'd originally come in on. She made it home safely that day on a completely different boat, picked up by other family members. The post also says Katie assumed the friends telling Nolan to get on wouldn't have left without him, and that her family has already given, in their words, all the answers they can give, both to Nolan's mother and to investigators. Katie herself has not given a direct, on-the-record interview to any outlet that I'm aware of. What we have is her account filtered through her sister on Facebook. That's a real human source. It is not a sworn statement, and it's not the same as Katie speaking for herself. Hold on to both of those facts at once. Don't throw the account out because it's secondhand, and don't treat it as settled fact either. Somewhere between those two extremes is where the truth about that afternoon probably sits. This particular contradiction is the one that gets under my skin the most, not because either version on its own proves anything happened to Nolan. It's because two people who were both physically standing there for the last real conversation he ever had shouldn't still disagree 2 weeks later about which direction he said he was walking. That's not a detail buried in legal paperwork or a lab report. It's the kind of thing 5 different people at a barbecue usually remember the same way without even trying. And here it still hasn't lined up. Here's what strengthens it, though. Jayvon Williams, who Nolan's own family and friends describe as his best friend, and who was also on Horn Island that day, gave an on-the-record interview to the Biloxi Sun-Herald. He said he last saw Nolan after 4 in the afternoon hanging out with a girl and other friends, and that both of them had left their phones behind on the boat Nolan originally arrived on. He also told CNN something that cuts directly against the story the friend group has told publicly. I've never known Nolan to stay back while his friends leave, he said. He's always been a guy where if he rode with you, he's going to come back with you. That's always how he's been every single time. A best friend describing a lifelong pattern of behavior on the record in 2 separate outlets is a different category of evidence than a Facebook post from a sibling, even if both of them point in roughly the same direction. A Facebook post from a family member is filtered through grief, through loyalty, through wanting to protect someone who's already been dragged into the middle of a national story she never asked to be part of. An on-the-record quote to the Biloxi Sun-Herald and CNN, under his own name, from the person Nolan's own family calls his best friend, carries a different kind of weight. It's the kind of statement that can be checked, followed up on, and held against everything else that comes out later. Put them side by side and you get a best friend who says this isn't who Nolan was, and a young woman's family who says he told her he was headed back to the boat. Neither one on its own tells you what happened. Together they raise the exact same question his own father raised in the first place. Back when this case was only days old, why would this be the one day Nolan broke the only rule his parents ever asked of him? If you go with a group, you stay with the group. That rule doesn't disappear just because 2 more weeks have passed and a few new names have entered the story. If anything, hearing it echoed now by his best friend independently in his own words makes it harder to write off as simply a parent's grief talking. There's more that doesn't line up. Police reports listed Wells as wearing black shorts the day he disappeared. His mother says photos from that day shared with her by a young woman who was on the island show him in blue swim trunks. It sounds like a small detail, and maybe it is. People misremember clothing all the time, especially describing someone's secondhand hours or days after the fact. But it's the kind of small detail that shouldn't require a grieving mother to go hunting down photographs herself in order to catch, and it's one more thread in a case that already has more loose threads than it should this far in. His family also says they had a strange, uncomfortable experience trying to get his car keys back, which had been left in a driveway belonging to one of his friends. Think about that for a second. Not handed over, not dropped off. The family had to go retrieve them themselves from a driveway the same way they'd had to go retrieve his phone. And his phone itself only came back to them with help from a location tracking app and a family friend, not from the friends who'd had it in the first place. Every single item that should have come back to this family automatically, his keys, his phone, a clear account of his last hours, has instead had to be tracked down or dug up by the family on their own. Once they had it, Christine Wansley says she found something that didn't sit right. Nolan updated his Snapchat constantly, the way most 18-year-olds do, several times a day without thinking twice about it. But there was no activity at all in the 24 hours before he disappeared. A total silence from an account that was never silent. And the location attached to the account didn't match where his actual phone was later found. That mismatch alone doesn't prove tampering. Location data on phones drifts and lags all the time, especially near open water with spotty cell coverage between an island and the mainland. But paired with an account that suddenly stopped posting the day its owner went missing. It's the kind of detail that deserves a real explanation rather than a shrug. None of these details, taken alone, proves anything happened to Nolan that wasn't a tragic accident. Clothing gets misremembered. Keys get left in the wrong place after a long day of drinking. Phones get handed off and forgotten in a panic. Any single one of these by itself is exactly the kind of loose end you'd expect from a chaotic, unsupervised holiday on a crowded island. But all of it together, the shorts, the keys, the phone, the Snapchat silence, is a lot of small, specific things that a family has had to go dig up on their own, one piece at a time, instead of being handed a clear account by the people who were there with him. Tracestin Shepard, the friend who publicly corrected the record on that viral video, saying the yelling voice on it was his own and not Nolan's, gave another interview this week that adds something honest to this. He said the friend group had been drinking since late morning, after several boats carrying them arrived on Horn Island. That's not a small admission for someone in his position to make on the record. He also said plainly that he's waiting for the facts before forming any more opinions of his own. If it turns out somebody harmed Nolan, he said, he hopes justice is brought. If it was a tragic accident where somebody simply didn't speak up, he said he hopes justice is brought there too. I just know I've lost my best friend, he said. I think that's worth sitting with for a second. Shepard has already put his own name on the line once, correcting the record at real personal risk, given that he and his friends have reportedly received death threats over this. He could have used that same platform to defend his friend group harder, or to push back on the public suspicion around all of them. That would have been the easier move, honestly the one most people in his position would make. Circle the wagons, say the whole thing has been blown out of proportion, and wait for the story to move on. Instead, he's leaving the door open to either outcome publicly with his own name attached to it, and admitting to something as simple and as damaging as a full day of drinking on the record when he didn't have to volunteer that detail at all. Whatever else is true about that day, that's a harder thing to do than staying quiet would have been, and it's worth giving him credit for it, even while we keep asking hard questions about everyone who was on that island. Meanwhile, the piece everyone's waiting for still hasn't arrived. The independent autopsy commissioned by the family and conducted in Washington, D.C. was originally expected around July 10th. Crump has said that slipped because of trouble getting Nolan's body transported, a logistical problem rather than anything to do with the findings themselves, at least as far as anyone outside that process knows. The official state autopsy remains in the same holding pattern, waiting on toxicology results that can take days or weeks, depending on lab capacity. And Mississippi's state lab, like most state labs, doesn't fast-track a case just because it's gotten national attention. Two separate medical processes in two separate jurisdictions, both stalled at the exact moment public attention on this case is at its highest. That timing isn't anyone's fault. Toxicology work simply takes as long as it takes, whether the person being tested is a private citizen nobody's heard of, or the center of a story with Al Sharpton and Tyler Perry's names attached to it. But it does mean that for now, every theory floating around online, every version of what supposedly happened on that island, is being built on top of an incomplete medical record. Whatever the final cause of death turns out to be, it hasn't been confirmed publicly yet by either side. I want to be direct about something because it's become its own problem inside this story. Multiple established outlets have reported on just how much false information has filled the silence while everyone waits for real results. If you see a claim online right now saying the autopsy results are already out, especially one describing some dramatic new finding, treat it with real skepticism until it's confirmed by a named source you can actually check. That gap between an emotional public and a slow, careful process is exactly where fabricated claims tend to spread the fastest, and this case has had more than its share of that already. It's worth remembering that every rumor that turns out false doesn't just waste attention. It makes the real findings, whenever they land, harder for people to trust. Katie now has a name and a family account behind her, even if it's still secondhand. A named best friend on the record in two outlets has directly challenged the version where Nolan simply chose to stay behind on his own. The FBI is involved, at least in some advisory capacity. Formal separate witness interviews are underway. Shorts that don't match, keys retrieved from a driveway, a phone recovered only with outside help, and a Snapchat account that went silent at the exact wrong moment are all sitting there, unresolved, waiting on an explanation nobody in the friend group has offered publicly yet. And both autopsies, the one the state is running and the one the family paid for independently, remain stuck with no release date in sight. None of that adds up to an answer yet. It adds up to a case that's clearly bigger, messier, and further from settled than it looked a week ago, back when the only public statement anyone had to go on was a single line from the sheriff's office saying no foul play was suspected. A week of formal interviews, an FBI contact, a named best friend on the record, and a family speaking for a young woman who still hasn't spoken for herself is a lot of movement for 7 days. It's also notably still not an arrest, still not a cause of death, and still not a single named suspect. Both things can be true at once. This case has moved a great deal this week, and it still hasn't answered the one question everyone wants answered. And in the middle of all of it is a mother who, when she talks about her son now, keeps circling back to one small, unremarkable memory that has nothing to do with any of this. Christine Wansley has said the last time she saw her son in person was the night before the trip. She'd made the family salmon for dinner. He was heading out to spend the night with friends ahead of the holiday. He told her, "Hey, Mom, I'm about to go. I love you." A hug, a kiss, and he left. That's the whole thing. No timeline, no contradiction, no phone, no boat. Just a mother's memory of an entirely ordinary goodbye that turned out without her knowing it in that moment to be the last one she'd ever get. Every other detail in this case is being argued over by lawyers, investigators, and strangers online, myself included. The shorts, the keys, the phone, the Snapchat account, Katie's version, Jayvon's version, the FBI, the sheriff's changed tone. All of it is public now. All of it is being picked apart by people who never met Nolan Wells. That one memory isn't. It belongs only to Christine Wansley, the way it would belong to any mother, and no update to this case, whatever it eventually turns out to be, is going to change what that goodbye meant to her. When the FBI's role gets clearer, or when either autopsy finally comes back, I'll bring you the update the same way I've brought you everything else in this case, straight through, without getting ahead of what's been confirmed. I'd rather be a week behind the truth than a day ahead of a rumor, and this case has already shown what happens when the second one wins out. I want to know what you think really happened between Nolan and Katie that afternoon, and whether you believe his friend's version at all. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. This story isn't over, so subscribe if you don't want to miss what comes next. Monsters don't exist, but people capable of monstrous things do.